Through the Eyes of a Servant, Chapter 1, A Deadly Mistake. Thomas Fulton, 24 years old, profession, butler. The intelligent and somewhat sensitive man was born into a working-class family, fortunately at the higher end than most unlucky souls. Since his youth, he was fascinated with the upstanding nobles, duchesses, and earls, always dreaming to meet them. Sadly, his father disapproved of his ambition of becoming a butler, believing the career only looked good on paper. Yet, despite his father's negative input, Thomas pursued his goals and found out firsthand what being a servant was all about. Working full-time as a butler was no easy feat for the man. It wasn't exactly how he envisioned it when he was younger. The hours were long, the holidays were scarce, but most of all, the isolation was enough to drive a sane man to beldam. Thomas didn't really want to resign, but sometimes he dwelled upon the thought. His master, Earl Eric Randall, was an austere man who had his doubts about everyone except Thomas. Due to Randall's scepticism, the butler was the sole servant in the entire manor. The Earl condemned anyone else to venture near his property, let alone prance inside. In spite of all the negatives, the Earl showered the butler with kindness and treated him more than fairly. Thus was the reason Thomas couldn't push himself to leave. Whenever his master wasn't busy directing his businesses, he always made time to play chess with the man. The two even mused over whiskey in the dining hall on chilly winter evenings. Seeing his master happy was the greatest thing the butler could ever wish for. Fulton. At last his master was back from the workhouse. Thomas hurried along to the front room. Eric lounged on his velvet armchair, smoking a worn cigar. The man's eyes flicked up when his butler appeared. "There you are, Fulton. What's your report for today?" The butler's brows furrowed, but only for a second. "As standard as yesterday, sir. The post arrived earlier on in the day, the milkman delivered 2 bottles, the paperboy rode past on schedule. No unauthorized individuals to report," he said. The blond man puffed grey smoke into the empty air, knocking the cigar's ash to the floor. "I see. Good." Thomas stood there awkwardly for a moment. The two of them hadn't had a leisurely conversation in a while. It was always about reports or scouting out suspicious individuals around the estate. It was the norm for the Earl, but Thomas wished his master would unwind for once. Just to break the tension between the two of them, the butler asked his master about work. "How was everything at the workhouse today, sir?" Thomas said. Eric gave a mixed look of empathy and determination. "The number of arrivals has risen. There are more abandoned children and homeless individuals who need our help." Thomas was staggered when he first found out about Randall's charitable hobbies. It's not often individuals of noble blood interact with the underclasses, let alone help them, but Eric was unique. On weekdays, the man would tend to his late father's confectionery business, and in his free time, he would oversee and send donations to the local workhouse. It was true that people of his own stature disliked him, but that didn't matter to Randall. When Eric saw the carefree faces of the workhouse children, his purpose was fulfilled. At least they saw him as a saviour. "You perform a great service, my lord." Eric stared off into the distance, almost looking teary-eyed. "One must fulfil the purpose he has been sent here to do, or, as you say, perform his duty to the very end." Eric gave the butler a small smile before taking another intoxicating puff of the dwindling cigar. Crushing the tip against the ashtray, he got up sluggishly, stopping at Thomas's side. "I will have my evening tea at the usual time. For now, I have some pressing work to get on with." As Eric stood to take his leave, Thomas had the sudden urge to hold him in his tracks. The butler reached out an arm, but stopped himself from tapping the blonde's back. Eric cocked his head over his shoulder. "Something the matter?" Carefully choosing his next words, the butler hesitantly spoke. Do you need me to aid you with your paperwork?" The man's forehead scrunched. His butler's reply seemed like it was fabricated on a whim. not at all what he really had on his mind. Eric caught sight of the clock. It was just past 5 in the afternoon. The man wished he could inquire about Thomas's thoughts, but having little time on his hands, he simply brushed it off. "I'll be fine, thank you, Fulton." The Earl laid a hand on his butler's shoulder and gave a slight nod. Thomas watched his master leave, looking to the ashes on the floor. He didn't know why, but an odd feeling continued to prey on him. His master appeared different today, tired, clumsy, like he'd been working too vigorously and hadn't slept in days. The butler imagined he could question it later, perhaps when he brought Eric his tea. There were 2 hours before then, and the servant had a perplexing task to get on with. Thomas went down to the cellar. He needed to reorganize the shelves and count the food supplies. As lengthy as the job was, it was all part of a butler's duty. It was both dusty and dingy in the cellar. A bit of cleaning needed to be conducted, but moreover, some natural light needed to grace the sandy concrete floor. The faint clicks of his pocket watch kept Thomas company. However, when he stopped by a barrel of red wine, he remembered how alone he was. Some of the rich, bloody liquid dripped from the barrel, pooling on the floor. There was an empty glass and an old newspaper on the tabletop nearby. Thomas smiled to himself and whispered, "So, this is where the master takes himself off to." He skimmed the headline, "Murder near St. James Park." His brow furrowed. Crime was like a rabid dog, terrorizing every nook of London. He prayed that one day all the suffering would end, and someone would stop all this madness. Sometimes he felt a reporter's career was far worse than any other. At least he wasn't exposed to such dastardly affairs. While hauling jars of oats and bottles of basil off the shelves, Thomas's hand grazed against something leathery. Cautiously bringing the object down, he realized he was holding an old scrapbook. The man let curiosity get the better of him. Flipping through the worn pages, he found the book was filled to the brim with photos of his master as a young lad. There were pictures of Mr. and Mrs. Randall, pictures of Eric attired in posh suits, and a photograph of little Eric and a greyhound puppy. There were a few photographs of Eric in sport attire with another boy. A note was written beside it, "Archie Stitch and Eric Randall, promising in the world of horse racing." This book was such a cherished item, so why on earth was it left to rot in the cellar? The last page of the book depicted Eric, Eric's father, another well-dressed gentleman, and a little girl standing outside what looked like a tea shop. Both men were shaking hands while holding on to their children. Eric had his father's hand tightly upon his shoulder, and the other gentleman was holding the small girl in his arms. Thomas inspected the photo closely. Eric had a shy grin on his face. He was staring at the girl. Was she his childhood sweetheart, perhaps? The butler shook his head and carefully placed the book back on the top shelf. It must have been placed there for some reason or another, so Thomas supposed he should leave it be. After dusting the stringy cobwebs from the ceiling and sweeping the last ounces of dust off the floor, Thomas wiped his brow and took out his pocket watch. The time was at hand to prepare his master's evening appetizers. Making his way upstairs, the butler rolled up his sleeves and tied an apron over his waistcoat. Thomas worked furiously over the kitchen counter, measuring out cups of sugar and raisins for a batch of scones. He couldn't push the thoughts of Eric's strange behaviour out of his head. Was he tired? Under pressure? After some reasoning, Thomas concluded his master must have been fatigued from staying up all night mending the window latches in his study. Honestly, the Earl could have gotten him to fix it instead of piling more stress onto himself. But as well as being unique, Eric was also quite the independent fellow. The buttery aroma of dough put an end to Thomas's daydreams. He pulled the baked goods out of the oven and began plating them with jam and clotted cream, not forgetting about the pot of Earl Grey which had been brewing on the stove. He placed the scones and the cup of tea on a tray before gingerly walking to the Earl's study. The halls were nippy. The fireplace must have burnt out again. the butler mumbled as he treaded onwards. It may have been just his imagination, but the butler could have sworn he heard a whisper emanating from somewhere. When Thomas reached his master's door, he hesitated for a second, then knocked twice and waited to hear Eric's gruff voice to call in forth. It never came. He knocked again, thinking his master must have fallen asleep, but when a reply did not come, he entered the cold room. Thomas dropped the tray with a clatter. His master's head lay still at the desk. The window was wide open behind him, causing gusts of wind to cascade into the room. Thomas felt increasingly nauseous as he got closer to the desk. Witnessing the blood seeping from Eric's back and neck, he had been stabbed. Brutally, cruelly, his flesh was mangled as if the assailant were drunk or stronger than 3 men put together. Eric's blonde hair was matted, red with his own blood, his pale skin also ruined to crimson. When seeing the Earl's bloodshot eyes, the butler retched into his hands. They were unnaturally wide, and they were giving the butler a hellish stare. They were no longer the determined blue pupils Thomas used to know. Eric's expression lay frozen, as if the last thing he saw was enough to petrify his very soul, even in death. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. Signet Ring. Through the Eyes of a Servant is now available on Amazon. Link in the description.